Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be exploring this complex relationship between genes, brains, and behavior. You've sent over some fascinating excerpts from scientific papers and book chapters that suggest there's more to the story than just our DNA.
Yeah, it seems like you've been considering some pretty intriguing ideas in neuroscience. The material you provided really pushes us to think beyond just a purely gene-centric view of behavior.
Yeah, the idea of levels of information in biology really jumped out at me. It seems like scientists are questioning if genes are truly the be-all and end-all, or if there are these emergent properties that we're missing by focusing only on genes.
It's a really crucial question. You need to understand the rules of a game like basketball to appreciate how the players interact, right? Similarly, just focusing on genes might not be enough to really grasp the intricate workings of the brain or the complexities of behavior.
So instead of focusing just on the genes themselves, these sources seem to be saying that we need to understand how genes influence cells, how those cells form circuits, and then how those circuits ultimately generate behavior.
That's a great way to put it. One of the papers that you sent uses this term algorithmic growth to describe how information seems to build upon itself at each level, creating properties that couldn't be predicted just from the genetic code.
Okay, so could you give me a concrete example of how algorithmic growth plays out in the brain?
Absolutely. Think about how individual neurons with these relatively simple firing patterns can interact to create these complex oscillations in brain networks. These oscillations, which kind of emerge from the collective activity of many neurons, are thought to play this crucial role in consciousness and cognition. It's a fascinating example of how these higher-level properties arise from the interactions of simpler components.
That's a much clearer way to understand algorithmic growth than just a definition. But hasn't there been a lot of research trying to find specific genes linked to behavior?
There has, and it certainly provided valuable insights. But one thing that stands out from the material that you shared is this caution against oversimplifying the relationship between genes and behavior.
So even if a study finds that a certain gene is more common in people with a particular trait, that doesn't necessarily mean that the gene causes that trait.
Exactly. One of the papers uses the search for a gay gene as a prime example. Huge genome-wide association studies haven't been able to pin down a single gene responsible for sexual orientation.
What's fascinating to me is that this challenges this traditional idea of a single gene controlling a complex behavior, right?
It really does. This research suggests that many genes, each with a small effect, contribute to these complex traits. Scientists refer to this as polygenic, meaning many genes are involved, and non-additive genetic effects, meaning the effects of these genes aren't simply added together, but they interact in these really intricate ways.
So it seems like the sources are pushing for this more nuanced view of gene-behavior relationships. Instead of looking for a gene for X, we need to think about the interplay of multiple genes and environmental factors.
Precisely. The material you've selected really emphasizes the importance of context. It's not just about having certain genes, it's about how those genes are expressed and influenced by the environment.
Could you give me an example of how this context idea plays out in real biological systems?
One compelling example from the readings is the transcription factor ILUS. This gene can trigger eye development, but only in specific cell types and at these precise developmental stages. It highlights how the same gene can have drastically different effects depending on the surrounding environment.
So even if you have the gene, it won't necessarily express itself in the same way in different environments or at different times.
Exactly. It's like how flour can be used to make bread cake or pasta depending on the other ingredients and how it's prepared.
There's a lot to unpack. It seems like scientists are moving away from these reductionist gene-centric views and kind of embracing a more holistic perspective that considers multiple levels of biological organization.
Absolutely. One of the sources proposes this really interesting framework for thinking about this complexity, the idea of players and rules.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How does this players and rules framework help us understand the relationship between genes, brains, and behavior?
Think of it like a game of chess. You have the players, the individual pieces, and you have the rules that govern how those pieces can move and interact. In biological systems, the players can be anything from molecules to cells to entire organs. And the rules are determined by the properties of these players and how they interact.
So instead of just cataloging the individual pieces, we need to understand the rules that govern their behavior.
Precisely. And that's where things get really interesting.
All right, let's dive into that. Give me an example of how this players and rules concept applies to something specific in the brain.
One of the excerpts uses the example of synaptotropic dendritic growth, which is the process where dendrites, the branches of neurons, grow towards synapses, the connections between neurons.
Okay, so what are the players in this scenario?
The players are philopodia. tiny finger-like projections extending from the dendrites. These filopodia act like explorers, constantly reaching out and retracting, searching for potential synaptic partners.
And what are the rules that guide these filopodias?
The rules are elegantly simple. A filopodium will continue to explore until it makes contact with a suitable target. Once it finds a target, it stabilizes, and the dendrite can then grow towards that point, forming a synapse.
So the filopodia are the players, and the rules determine how they interact to form connections.
That's right. And what's fascinating is that even a tiny change in one of the molecular components involved can alter the rules, leading to different developmental outcomes.
This is not just about the players themselves, but about how they interact within the system.
Exactly. And that's why this players and rules framework is so powerful. It allows us to study these complex biological processes without getting lost in the minutiae of molecular details.
This is all incredibly insightful, but I can't help but wonder, what does this all mean for us? How does this knowledge about genes, brains, and behavior apply to our everyday lives?
That's a great question. We've kind of laid the groundwork here by exploring the limitations of focusing solely on genes and embracing the importance of levels context and the players and rules concept. Now let's delve into some specific examples of how these concepts play out in real life and what they mean for our understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
I'm ready to dive deeper. Let's see how these complex scientific ideas translate into something we can all relate to.
So you're curious how this all connects back to us and our experiences?
Absolutely. It's
Wow.
fascinating stuff. But I want to understand how it plays out in the real world,
Well, let's revisit that gay gene research that we talked about earlier. As we discussed, studies haven't found a single gene that determines sexual orientation. Instead, it seems to be like this complex interplay of many genes and environmental factors.
It's like we're starting to see the limitations of that old nature versus nurture debate, right? It's not either. It's both kind of intertwined in these complex ways.
That's a great insight. The sources you shared really emphasize that genes kind of provide a starting point, but the environment plays a huge role in how those genes are expressed and how that ultimately influences behavior.
It's a reminder that we're not just predetermined by our genes. Our experiences shape who we are as well.
Precisely. And that brings us to another fascinating example from the material you sent, the migration of monarch butterflies.
Oh yeah, I was wondering about that. Those incredible journeys they make are mind-boggling.
They are remarkable, and scientists have been studying the genetic basis for this behavior. Interestingly, some monarch populations have evolved to become non-migratory. They've adapted to their local environments and no longer make those epic flights.
So even a behavior as seemingly ingrained as migration can change over time.
It can, which highlights the power of adaptation. One study compared the genomes of migratory and non-migratory monarchs, and they found differences in a gene related to muscle function. This suggests that non-migratory butterflies may have evolved to require less muscle mass since they don't need to fly as far.
That's fascinating. So evolution isn't just about survival of the fittest. It's also about adapting to different environments and fine-tuning even the most fundamental behaviors.
Exactly. It's this constant process of tweaking and adjusting for optimal survival. But just like with human sexuality, there's no single migration gene. It's a complex interaction of multiple genes and environmental cues.
It's a bit like those polygenic and non-additive effects we were talking about earlier, right? Multiple factors contributing to a complex outcome.
That's a great connection. It seems like there's this incredible flexibility in how genes are expressed and how that ultimately influences behavior, even for traits that seem really hardwired.
It's amazing to consider how adaptable living organisms can be.
It really is. This adaptability has allowed species, including our own, to thrive in such diverse environments.
Okay, so we've talked about sexuality and migration. But what about other complex human behaviors like aggression or addiction? Can those be linked to specific genes?
Researchers have found some interesting correlations, but as we discussed, correlation doesn't equal causation.
So just because a certain gene variant is more common in people who exhibit a certain behavior, it doesn't necessarily mean that gene causes the behavior, right?
You got it. It could be that the gene influences some other factor that contributes to the behavior, or it could even be a completely coincidental correlation. It's important to remember that even behaviors with a strong genetic component are always shaped by a combination of genes and environmental influences.
So even if we identify genes associated with certain behaviors, We don't have the full picture.
Right. It's like finding a piece of a puzzle without knowing where it fits or how it connects to the other pieces. We need more research to understand the context and the interplay of all the factors involved.
It sounds like we need to be cautious about drawing sweeping conclusions from genetic studies.
I agree. Genes are just one piece of a very complex puzzle.
Yeah.
And that puzzle is constantly evolving as we learn more about the intricate interplay of genes' environment and behavior.
So if we can't solely rely on genes to understand behavior, what are some other promising avenues of research?
Well, the sources you provided suggest that one promising direction is to focus on understanding the rules that govern these complex systems. Remember that chess analogy. If we can understand the rules of the game, we can better predict how the players will behave, even if we don't know everything about each individual player.
So instead of searching for specific genes for a behavior, we should try to understand the underlying principles that guide gene expression and the interactions between genes and the environment.
Exactly. This involves studying systems at multiple levels, from genes to cells to circuits, all the way up to the whole organism and its interactions with the environment. It's certainly a challenging task, but it's crucial for truly understanding the complexities of behavior.
It sounds like we need to kind of zoom in and out, focusing on both the fine details and the bigger picture.
Precisely. It's like appreciating a painting both up close to see the individual brushstrokes and from a distance to grasp the overall composition.
That's a great way to put it. But I'm curious, how do scientists actually study these rules in like a concrete way? What kind of tools or methods do they use in the lab?
That's a great question, and it leads us to some of the most cutting-edge research being done in neuroscience today. But before we dive into the specifics, let's take a moment to recap what we've covered so far.
Yeah, a recap would be helpful before we delve into the nitty-gritty of those research methods. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, from the limitations of gene-centric thinking to the importance of context and that fascinating players and rules concept. Now let's get to the part I'm really excited about. How are scientists actually putting these ideas into practice? What are they doing in the lab to unravel the complexity of the brain?
Well, one powerful tool in the neuroscientist's toolkit is optogenetics. It's a technique that allows researchers to control the activity of specific neurons using light. Remember those light-activated ion channels we touched on earlier?
Yes, the ones that can switch neurons on or off with pulses of light.
Yeah.
It sounded almost futuristic.
It is a remarkable technology, and it has revolutionized the way we study brain circuits. By precisely controlling the activity of individual neurons, scientists can observe how those changes ripple through the entire circuit. It's like having a microscopic remote control for the brain.
So they can pinpoint exactly which neurons are involved in specific behaviors.
Precisely. And that's incredibly valuable for understanding how these complex behaviors emerge from the coordinated activity of so many neurons. Optogenetics has been used to study a wide range of phenomena, from sleep and memory to addiction and fear.
It's like we're finally getting a handle on the neural circuits that underlie our actions and experiences.
And it's not just about mapping the circuits, it's about understanding the rules that govern how those circuits operate. By manipulating neuronal activity, scientists can test their hypotheses about how information flows through those circuits and how different neurons interact.
It's like being able to tweak the settings of a complex machine to see how it impacts performance.
A great analogy. And those insights can then be applied to develop new treatments for neurological and psychiatric disorders. For instance, if researchers can identify the specific neurons involved in anxiety, they might be able to develop more targeted therapies that act on those neurons without affecting other parts of the brain.
That's a game changer.
Oh.
It's like moving from using a sledgehammer to using a scalpel.
Exactly. That's the power of understanding those players and rules at a deeper level. It paves the way for more precise and effective interventions.
Okay, so optogenetics is one powerful tool. Are there other approaches scientists are using to study these intricate systems?
Absolutely. Another exciting area is connectomics, which focuses on mapping the connections between neurons in the brain.
Wow, that sounds ambitious. How do they even begin to map something as intricate as the brain's wiring diagram?
It's a monumental task for sure. But scientists are making progress using advanced imaging techniques like electron microscopy. They can take incredibly thin slices of brain tissue and image them at incredibly high resolution. This allows them to trace the paths of individual axons and dendrites and see how they connect to form synapses.
So it's like creating a detailed roadmap of the brain's communication network.
Exactly. And just like a roadmap helps you navigate a city, a connectome can help scientists navigate the complex circuitry of the brain. It can reveal the underlying architecture of brain function and shed light on how different regions of the brain are interconnected.
It seems like that would be crucial for understanding how the brain processes information and generates behavior.
Absolutely. Connectomics research is already providing insights into the neural basis of various cognitive functions, including learning, memory, and decision-making.
It's mind-boggling to think that we might one day have a complete map of the human brain's connections.
It's a goal that many neuroscientists are working towards, but it's a long road ahead. The human brain is estimated to have over 86 billion neurons, each with thousands of connections. Mapping all those connections is a monumental challenge.
It's a good reminder of just how complex and intricate our brains really are.
Yeah.
But even if we don't have a complete connectome yet, the research being done now is still incredibly valuable, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Every new connection mapped brings us closer to understanding how our brains work and give rise to our thoughts, feelings, and actions. That knowledge has the potential to transform our understanding of ourselves and our place in the universe.
It's exciting to think about all the uncharted territory that still lies ahead in brain research. What an incredible time to be witnessing these discoveries.
I couldn't agree more. The coming decades are sure to bring even more groundbreaking insights into the brain and its extraordinary capabilities.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener. We challenged some assumptions about genes and behavior, explored new ways of thinking about these complex systems, and got a glimpse of the cutting-edge research that's pushing the boundaries of neuroscience. It's clear that we've still got a lot to learn, but the progress being made is truly inspiring.
It really is. And as we continue to unravel the mysteries of the brain, we'll undoubtedly gain a deeper understanding of ourselves, our behavior, and the nature of consciousness itself.
It leaves me with a sense of wonder and excitement for what the future holds. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of neurobiology.
It's been my pleasure. And to our listeners, we'll leave you with this thought. If even something as seemingly hardwired as monarch butterfly migration can evolve and change, what does that say about the potential for our own brains to adapt and grow? What new connections and pathways might we forge as we continue to learn and evolve as individuals and as a species? Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the mysteries of the brain. We'll see you next time.